Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, Ideas 1, Part 2, the Fundamental Phenomenological Outlook, and Chapter 4, the Phenomenological Reductions. So this is what we're looking at today. Before we get into the content itself, just a note that at the end of this video I'm going to revise my position on Husserl's impersonal consciousness, or his claim that pure consciousness is ultimately conceivable as something inanimate and impersonal. We looked at that at the end of the last video, where I didn't really like it. I kind of disagreed with it, but in preparing for this video, I kind of saw a sense in which I think it does make sense, and it is perhaps conceivable. So I wanted to just revisit that and maybe amend my position a little bit. So anyway, we'll do that at the end of the video. As for the video itself, the content, usually I break the video up into different sections, but this whole chapter is really a cohesive section in itself, so I haven't done that. We're just looking to answer a single question in this chapter, and that is, what are we bracketing? What comes under this phenomenological epoche? The reduction, another word. All these words are the same, describe the same thing, the same operation. So what are we bracketing? The first thing that Husserl discusses here is the natural world. We've talked about this a lot over the past few videos, the natural attitude, and the conclusion is definitely we are suspending this entire realm. We're suspending all individual objectivities, and that means all physical things, but also all of the empirical sciences that give us knowledge about these individual objectivities. So all of the sciences that deal with the natural and the mental as regards the physical world, these individual objectivities that we see through the natural attitude. Good. Then the second thing that Husserl turns to is this pure ego. We haven't really, it has cropped up before, but we haven't looked at it in any great detail. And even here, it isn't really defined, I don't think. I mean, I couldn't find a clear definition of it here, but it seems to be the sense of sameness or identity, perhaps, that accompanies every experience. Or maybe a better way to put it is this: it's the kind of focal point around which all experiences or cogitations are oriented. And so it's present in not just in pure consciousness itself, but it's present in all of the constituted experiences that we have as well. So perhaps the best way to explain it at first is to look at what it's not. So the pure ego is different from the psychological ego subject, which we talked about at the end of last video. The ego subject of psychology is, remember, pure consciousness grasped as an empirical object, grasped as something corporeal, i.e. in the spatio-temporal world, through that natural attitude. That is not what the pure ego is. And it's also different from pure consciousness. So pure consciousness is more like a field in which cogitations or experiences take place, or which maybe a better way to put that is which constitutes cogitations or experiences. And this is still I'll just throw it in, this is not like some kind of It's not a mystical or supernatural or religious kind of term at all, pure consciousness. It's not even like so it's not a universal consciousness that in which we're all immersed or any kind of nonsense like that. Husserl is not into that kind of metaphysical speculation. It's still local. It's pure consciousness is a local field. It's a field around that in which your experiences are constituted, or in which the experiences that you have are constituted, or in which you constitute your experiences. However you want to put it, however you want to phrase it, as long as you have that idea, then if you have the idea kind of round the right way, then you'll be fine. But it's this local field which constitutes those experiences or cogitations. Pure ego, then, is that, and I quite like this way of putting it, actually. I just thought of it as I'm making this video, that focal point. It's the focal point which orients that field, and therefore it orients every cogitation or experience that arises within it, or that is constituted within it. So even though it arises in every experience, it's still different from the ego subject. So we're still not imagining this ego in the natural world in any way, shape, or form. It's still separate from that. It's still removed. It's still the natural world and all of those empirical objectivities have been bracketed out. So we don't want to slip back into this way of thinking of pure ego as an empirical ego subject. But yeah, like this idea of an orientation which pure consciousness, that field of pure consciousness takes on. And I think it's helpful to break this up and these two things apart, pure consciousness and pure ego. It's helpful to do that, to separate them, only to clarify or understand this whole phenomenon, what we're talking about. Because in truth, I think these two aspects, maybe, or however you want to term it, whatever you want to call it, these two are always come together. They're always intertwined, and they always appear together, like two sides of the same coin. In fact, there is no such thing as pure consciousness on its own or pure ego on its own. They're always welded together, and they always appear together. On their own, they are pure abstractions. They have absolutely no meaning separate or apart. But in order to clarify what's going on, in order to understand what and how pure consciousness is and operates, I think there's value in separating them out. And I think that's what Husserl's doing. He's separating them out, even though the two things are fundamentally inseparable. Not unlike the way that Heidegger treats being in the world and being in time. If you remember there, he breaks up that articulated whole, being in the world, analyzes it in those three chapters: in the world, being, and being in. So he breaks it up, analyzes each part separately, but he's clear, on their own they mean nothing. They are an articulated whole. They have to be considered in that way. And I think it's the same thing here. We've got this pure ego as this kind of focal point which orients the pure consciousness and all of its cogitations and experiences, but it's not something separate. It has absolutely no meaning divorced from pure consciousness. Two sides of the same coin. So with that said, then, clearly we can't reduce the pure ego. We can't bracket it out. The pure ego appears to be necessary in principle, and as that which remains absolutely self-identical in all real and possible changes of experience, it can in no sense be reckoned as a real part or phase of the experiences themselves. And so by that last section, can in no sense be reckoned as a real part or phase of the experiences themselves, Husserl means it cannot be considered as something constituted, as a constituted transcendent being. It's not a part of, if we divide the two sides here into constituting and constituted, it's on the constituting side. It's on that side of pure consciousness, that side of immanent being, as opposed to the other side, which is where our transcendent experiences arise. The constituted, the pure ego cannot be considered as something transcendent, as something constituted. It's necessary in principle, fine. However, Husserl does go on to say that we can think of it as transcendent in the sense that it stands outside pure consciousness. So we can think of it, like I said, it's helpful to break it apart in this way, even though in reality, I think it doesn't break apart, but we can consider it transcendent in a sense. So he calls it, finally, a non-constituted transcendence, a transcendence in immanence. So it has this kind of the sense in which it kind of does, we can separate it and understand something deeper here, understand more about what's going on in pure consciousness, but not really. So we get this kind of fudge in meanings, a transcendence in immanence. And so we've said that we can't suspend it, we can't reduce it, but for what Husserl wants to investigate in ideas, i.e. the pure consciousness, that domain of pure consciousness, we can effectively set the pure ego to the side. We can disregard it. So he says we won't be studying it here. He says that he'll address it later in book 2. Ideas 2, I haven't read Ideas 2, so I don't know if he follows through on that promise or not. But for the rest of Ideas 1, we're not going to concern ourselves with the pure ego, even though it cannot be bracketed out. The next thing we look at is God. And we're going to bracket this. We're going to bracket God out. Not so much because God doesn't exist. Husserl's not going to weigh in on any of these kinds of metaphysical claims. But we're bracketing it because we're bracketing it, him, he, she, whatever, however you want to describe God. We're bracketing God just because what we're trying to investigate, remember, is this field of pure consciousness. And God, if it exists, cannot possibly come into such a thing. He says, if God exists, it would thus be an absolute in a totally different sense from the absolute of consciousness. As on the other hand, it would be a transcendent in a totally different sense from the transcendent in the sense of the world. Therefore, whether God exists or not is kind of irrelevant. It's not what we're interested in. Bracket it. And finally, we come to the eidetic. So, we have suspended all individual objectivities of the natural world. Now we're turning to the general objects, the essences. That's what Eidetics is about. That's what Eidetics is getting at. The subject matter, if you like, of Eidetics. And these are, Husserl says, in a certain way transcendent to pure consciousness again. Transcendent again, in the sense that in order to exist, in order for essences as these general universal things to exist, as objects, they have to exist. In order for these things to exist, they have to exist as objects, which means they have to exist for a constituting consciousness, for a pure consciousness. So in that sense, even no matter how immanent they are, there is always a sense in which they are different from, they stand out from that, they're transcendent to pure consciousness. And so Husserl says then, given this, that essences are in a way transcendent, we can't disconnect all transcendence, all transcendent objects, or there could be no possibility of a science of pure consciousness at all, right? No content. If there's no content, then you can't have any science. And if we bracket everything that's transcendent, that is everything that's outside of the pure constituting consciousness, there's nothing left. There's nothing left to investigate. No objects have been constituted. Because as soon as you constitute an object, it is, by definition, different from or transcendent to pure consciousness. Even if it's, that link is not quite as, even if that separation, that break is not quite as clear cut as you might like, in order to exist as an object, it has to become something different from pure consciousness, transcendent to pure consciousness. But we can't disconnect all transcendent objects that are transcendent in this way, or there's nothing left. So there are two parts to the Eidetic that Husserl addresses. The first is formal logic. And this we're going to bracket. So we are going to suspend all formal logic. And this includes all what Husserl calls formal mythesis. So kind of science, especially mathematics related. So things like algebra, theory of numbers, theory of manifolds, these kinds of things. All theoretical constructs come under this as well. So formal logic we're bracketing, although Husserl did kind of seem to and ah a little bit about this in the book, perhaps for our benefit, but because they seem so indispensable to any scientific endeavor, right? How can you have a science without formal logic, without these kinds of, without the capacity for forming theoretical constructs? However, for if we may take it for granted that the inquiry of phenomenology into pure consciousness sets itself and need set itself no other task than that of making such descriptive analyses as can be resolved into pure intuition, the theoretical framework of the mathematical disciplines and all the theorems which develop within it cannot be of any service. So, phenomenology is purely descriptive, and all of its insights come from pure intuition. Remembering that intuition is not like a feeling that something's true, or some kind of, sixth sense kind of intuition. See, even I'm using the word, even some kind of sixth sense access to reality, some way of grasping these kinds of things that's non-sensory, nothing like that. It's just the immediate grasp of objects in experience. So it's certain because it's your experience. You can't be, if you're perceiving, if you're understanding your perceptions clearly, you can't be deceived about it. You can be deceived about the content of them, sure, but if you're analyzing that perception itself, the structures that go into that perception, that make up your consciousness, then you can't be, it's possible to get certainty. It's possible to have certitude here if you're thinking clearly, if you're analyzing these experiences clearly enough. So we don't need formal logic for this. We don't need to construct theories using concepts and kind of empty formal logic, because we're grasping our subject matter directly through pure intuition. We're just seeing what we are experiencing directly. We don't have to create theories about this. It's phenomenology is a direct science. So that's nice. I like that, actually. And that means that we can bracket formal logic. But then he turns to the second part of Eidetics, the material eidetic disciplines. So material eidetic, what does he mean by this? Not material, I think, as in physical matter, but as in having content, i.e. not formal. So the non-formal eidetic disciplines. And not all of these material essences will survive the bracket, will get through the bracket. However, there is one eidetic field we absolutely cannot bracket, Husserl says, and that is the essential domain of the phenomenologically purified consciousness itself, that of all immanental essences. So that is going to be preserved. We can't bracket that. Whatever happens, or the essences that describe what happened within the individual experiences of a stream of consciousness, those things, those immanent essences are going to make it through the bracket. And this means then that it's really important that we keep in mind and understand this transcendent immanent distinction. So as we've already seen, there's a transcendent immanent distinction between individual objectivities. So we've got the thing, which appears through perspectives, and we've also got the empirical sciences, physics, biology, etc., which study those things. They are all transcendent. And then on the other hand, we have the Erlebnis experience, which is absolute, which is immanent. And that's the side of the constituting. And that's another way to think of it. So that constituted is the transcendent. It always appears in or through perspectives. It's phenomenal being, but as opposed to the constituting side here, which is the immanent side, which is absolute being and which is necessary and certain. This is the experience itself as opposed to what it is that we're experiencing. So we have to keep in mind those two distinctions, right? Those are the transcendent immanent distinctions as far as individual objectivities are concerned. But we have the same distinction with eidetics, with the general universalizable essences. So we have the transcendent, which again correspond to what we saw with the individual objectivities, the individual transcendent objectivities. We've got the essences of those transcendent things, which include things like thing itself, spatial shape, movement, color of a thing, person, and so on and so forth. These are essences that explain, or that not explain, but that make the thing what it is, that make the objective thing the thing that it is. And we also have essences of the transcendent empirical sciences. And the essences of these are things like, or these essences, I should say, are things like geometry, kinematics, the pure physics of matter, Husserl calls it, and also things like psychology, sociology. So these are essential aspects of the empirical sciences we looked at before that deal with individual objects, individual transcendent objects. So that there are those essences, those transcendent essences, but there's also an immanent, a class of immanent essences, and these refer to the essential nature of the transcendentally purified consciousness. And that is what we cannot bracket. So we can bracket all of the transcendent essences, these material eidetic essences, but we can't bracket the immanent one, the immanent ones, the ones that concern the transcendentally purified consciousness, pure consciousness itself. So basically, that is the bulk of the video. Now I want to turn to that last, to the idea of this impersonal consciousness. So in the last video, I said regarding that quote, what was the quote? If I can just quickly pull it up. My consciousness, however its states of experience might vary, would remain an absolute stream of experience with its own distinctive essences. This is even if we imagine everything's gone, there's nothing left. No bodies, no people, no psychological experience, etc. Certainly an incorporeal and, paradoxical as it may sound, even an inanimate and non-personal consciousness is conceivable, i.e. a stream of experience in which the intentional, empirical unities, body, soul, and empirical ego subject do not take shape. And I said, so my criticism here was, okay, this is kind of going a bridge too far, or this is a bridge too far. Immanent and transcendent are different, check. The transcendent depends on the immanent, check. And then the notion that the immanent can exist without the transcendent. That was where I had the problem. As if you can have this immanent realm without any kind of transcendent content. So I thought that the immanent depends on the transcendent as well. As I said, consciousness is intentional. Without content, what's left? And without experience, what is a stream of experience? That was what I was thinking at the time I recorded the last video. The first thing I would say about that is that the way I've phrased it, I think, is not clear. It's not good. So I said the immanent can exist without the transcendent. That way of thinking, I think, is misleading. It makes the immanent and the transcendent sound like separate things that have some kind of real existence, or even worse, separate consciousnesses or separate parts of consciousness. It's definitely nothing like that. So that's not a good way to think about this. Immanent and transcendent, the difference is more like the objects that pure consciousness takes for itself. It's a description of those objects. So yeah, we don't want to start thinking of immanent and transcendent as two different realms or two separate anythings. We don't really want to think about it in that way. So when we say transcendent, we're talking about transcendent objects. And when we say immanent, we're talking about immanent objects. That is to say, the experience itself, as opposed to the contents of that experience. And second, immanent reflection isn't lacking content, I think. That was a mistake when I said Consciousness is intentional without content, what's left. So even though there is no transcendent content, as in content that is only graspable through those perspectives, those Abschattung, there is still content, as Husserl has made clear in this chapter. There are still general, essential structures of pure consciousness which appear, that is to say, as objects for our immanent reflexive glance. So there is still some content. There has to be, as Husserl says here in this chapter, without content, without some form of transcendent in the sense of being an object for pure consciousness. Without that, there is no science. So we must have that, and it is there. That's the thing. I missed that in the last video, and we'll look at what these are in a couple of videos' time. So that's coming. And third, I also wasn't happy with the notion of impersonal, because it starts to drift into like a Buddhisty or universal consciousness we're all a part of. Consciousness is everywhere, or it's a unity, and we're all parts of it in some way, and we can dissolve into this. We get into rampant metaphysical or religious speculation. But I think maybe we don't have to go there with Husserl here. We don't need to go down that path. Even though it's impersonal, it's still, like I was saying before, it's still a local field. There's no sense in which we can start thinking about an impersonal consciousness as a universal ocean of consciousness that we're all immersed in. That's just completely lacking from Husserl. So that's fine. There's no real danger of that, and it still makes sense to think of pure consciousness, even though it's impersonal, to think of it as a local field. And it's impersonal then. How is it impersonal? I think in the sense that it lacks specific, individual, empirical content. That's all Husserl means when he says impersonal. That it lacks, and it's in the quote too, i.e. a stream of experience in which the intentional empirical unities, body, soul, empirical ego, subject, do not take shape. So impersonal just means lacking those transcendent realities. So there's still the pure ego. There's still pure consciousness, pure with that pure ego orienting it. That's the way I've been describing it. But it's impersonal because this is just the way that Husserl's defining the word impersonal, as lacking these empirical, individualizing, transcendent objects. So I think there's I'm kind of I really came around to this idea of the impersonal consciousness, as long as we understand it correctly, as long as we, and I think this is at least a way in which it makes sense to me, at least. And my original reaction was and still is, I think, metaphysical in nature, primarily. It's that idea that suddenly we're drifting into not talking about experience anymore, but talking about kind of a metaphysical reality, an impersonal. That was just what was in my mind, impersonal. So we're now divorcing consciousness from any kind of individual, any kind of person, and we are, but if we understand it the way Husserl means it, that means just getting rid of the transcendent, the empirical, the individualizing, transcendent again contents, but there is still this sense in which it's localized. It's just lacking that sense of the personal. And any kind of metaphysical objection to Husserl is always going to be wrong, because Husserl just is not interested in metaphysics. Nothing that he does, I think, can be, and certainly shouldn't be, understood as making a metaphysical claim. So, and this is something I think that throws a lot of people, and it threw me until really like this morning, where thinking about the transcendental ego, right, or pure ego, or transcendental idealism, or however we think about Husserl's project, it's transcendental in nature, but it's not a metaphysical transcendence. That's where I think certainly I was going astray in my dislike for Husserl, was because it carries this notion of, a metaphysical reality, transcendence. It's some kind describing the true nature of reality, and he is, but he's doing it in a completely non-metaphysical way. That's what phenomenology is. It's an attempt to understand pure consciousness, not as some reified metaphysical truth, but as just what we actually experience, what we can actually know, how we know the things that we know, or how we perceive, how we remember, how we judge, how we do any of the cognitive functions that we're capable of, and that's what makes it. I think the more I read of Husserl, the more I realize that is the focus for him. It's even though we're talking about a transcendental ego, and transcendence, the word crops up an awful lot in Husserl, it's not metaphysical. And I think once you realize that, then all barriers to object, or all of the barriers to accepting Husserl kind of fall away. Well, they did for me anyway. Once I realized that actually, he's just describing our conscious experience, the structures of human experience. And these are the things that we can know for certain by just looking at how experience is constructed for us, how it's constituted for us. So I've really come to appreciate Husserl a lot more over the last couple of weeks. And I'm reading Cartesian Meditations, and I just finished reading Crisis as well. Those were really good books. But anyway, I'm starting to ramble. But as long as you remember that none of this is metaphysical. It's all, phenomenology is totally, I believe, ametaphysical. So keep that in mind, and I think Husserl is much more digestible and makes sense. He just makes sense if you drop the tendency to see Husserl in metaphysical, understand him in metaphysical terms. All right, let's hit a summary. So first we looked at the subjects which are going to be bracketed. And the first of these was the natural world. So all of those individual objectivities. And this included both the thing itself, the objects which appear through perspectives, and the physical sciences and the mental sciences which deal with those individual objectivities. We're also bracketing God, not because God is real or not real, or there's no metaphysical assertions here. It's just God is not what we're dealing with. If God exists, he's absolute in a way that has nothing to do with the absolute being we uncovered in consciousness. And if he is transcendent, he's transcendent in a way that is in a totally different sense from the transcendent we discovered in the sense of the world. So just not what we are looking at all. Then we looked at Eidetics. We came to this subject of Eidetics, and we're bracketing here formal logic, unnecessary for phenomenology, which is a descriptive science, so everything is directly accessible to us, and the material Eidetics. And we're bracketing here those two categories, the essences of the transcendent objectivities, so things like things, spatial shape, person, essences of the objects in the natural world, and also the essences of the transcendent sciences that describe those things in the natural world. So we talked about geometry, pure physics, psychology, sociology, those kinds of things. So that's all getting bracketed. Which leaves us with the last part, the subjects which survive the bracket or make it or comprise the phenomenological residuum. And there are two, the pure ego and the essential nature of the transcendentally purified consciousness. And that is this chapter. So hopefully that makes some sense for you, that clarifies something. This was so difficult for me to get through. I actually filmed this last week, but was so dissatisfied with what I did that I just scrapped it, and that's why I'm a week late with this one. But I hope it helped. It makes a lot of sense to me when I'm writing it up, when I'm preparing it, and then when I come to explain it, it's like, what? It all gets kind of somewhere lost between here and here. So anyway, hopefully that helped. Let me call it here, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.